Welcome to Full Prefrontal, the show that exposes the mysteries of executive functions. This show is a collection of conversations about the role of the prefrontal cortex, which impacts your focus, planning, problem-solving, emotional balance, and independence. These conversations will introduce mental tools that will empower you to shift your mindset for a successful life. And now, here's your host, Sucheta Kamath.
Good morning and welcome back to Full Prefrontal, where we are exposing the mysteries of executive function. I am here with our host, as always, Sucheta Kamath. Good morning, Sucheta. This is going to be a pretty intriguing conversation. Well, frankly, all of our conversations are quite intriguing, but I'm looking forward to this one. But lead us off. Help us understand. I mean, we all have these educational experiences, and those all feed are ultimately how we go through life and informs our strengths and weaknesses. Talk us through that a bit.
Well, thank you, Todd, and it's great to be with you today. And yes, you bring up such a great point that we have educational experiences and that kind of shape our own understanding of our strengths and weaknesses. And not everything is rosy, as you know. We may have more weaknesses than strengths, and we need education and learning to shape that. And it can be the other way. We can have lots of strengths, but learning and formally participating in education can create a lot of challenges, and that turns out to be a weakness. So anyway, when my kids were, I have two boys and they are now young adults. But when they were little, my husband used to always tease them and say, "Why are you guys studying? You should know this already." And I used to remind my husband that he has this somewhat inflated memory of his own skills and abilities. When I met my husband, we were 19 and he was in medical school. And in fact, my family has this vivid memory of all of us getting together. And there was a India-Pakistan game, a cricket match going on television. It was televised and all of us were facing the television and shouting and screaming. And my husband was facing against the television, and he was sitting at the dining table with complete and full concentration as he was preparing for a big exam he had coming up. So I think he has a sense that he never had needed to study, and all his learning has been natural, and he has just breathed into his consciousness. So I always admired this about my husband, but that's not me. I'm a different kind of learner. I'm in fact very good at coming up with strategies and tricks for myself because things never stick to my brain like a Velcro. What has really carried me through is my deep desire for learning and passion for learning. And I enjoy challenges that learning brings up. And I do take a lot of initiative to invent tricks for myself because of my curious mindset. But learning has never been a natural process. In my lifetime, I have met some friends who actually would browse through their Grey's Anatomy, for example, when they were in medical school, and they would memorize every single paragraph on every single page and be able to locate it in their brain using visual images. That's just not me. So what I'm trying to get to is, there are people who take their strengths for granted, and they may end up in a place where they hate their weaknesses. But I find that since I have entered in this arena as a professional, I spend all my time helping youngsters and adults overcome their weaknesses and learn more about their weaknesses to become more proficient. And I have spent all my life helping them develop a better relationship with their weaknesses. And how do people really get to know what is their profile of learning? That's what I'm going to talk about today. And that's the expert we have who is going to shed some light on it. So let me quickly share a story of a student who came to me in 10th grade. Let's call this kid James. And I received a report from his educational psychologist who described that when James was born, he was born off a full term without any complications during pregnancy. There were a few issues related to sleep, but other than that, he had great skill set as he was hitting every early developmental milestone, and all of them were attained within normal limits. When James entered kindergarten, he was playful but distractible and always last to start and last to finish. And by the time he was 8, this last to start, last to finish business became a little bit of a barrier. So the parents took him to a psychologist, and he was eventually diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which is ADHD, and was taken to a pediatrician who eventually prescribed Adderall. And that medicine had its ups and downs, and eventually it was discontinued because of the side effects. And at this point, when James came to me, he wasn't taking any medication. So as I began to take the history, a conversation came up about when did the challenges in learning become a roadblock in academic and personal success. And I found out that second week of ninth grade, James withdrew from local private school and enrolled into online academy. And he began to receive failing grades last year, but he was passing everything except honors biology. And the reasons for withdrawal were personal. There were lots of personal crises, parents going through divorce, having a very, massive custody battle. The son was moved with a caretaker. The father had a international traveling job. He was hardly in the country, but the mother had significant psychiatric breakdown, and she was in and out of psychiatric hospitals. She had substance abuse problems, on and on. So James, in this shuffle, got lost. And of course, his learning problems, which were diagnosed in since third grade, became a bigger barrier, but he was never prepared for it. And that's what brought him in front of the psychologist, and the results of the psychological testing brought James to me. So what I am trying to get to today, Todd, is the journey of a childhood educational path may be very treacherous, not easy, or bumpy or smooth, but sometimes we need that external information, external guide. We need some formal information regarding the profile of our inner capacities. And that's why I have this expert today. Her name is Dr. Judy Wolman. She's a psychologist in my neck of the woods, which is Sandy Springs. She, in fact, is in the building over. I have known her for the last 17 years, ever since I moved to Atlanta from Boston. She specializes in psychoeducational evaluations, family therapy regarding child-related issues, and psychotherapy for children and adolescents. She received her Ph.D. in developmental school psychology at Georgia State University in December of 1984. And prior to that, she received a master's in learning disability in 1976 and a Bachelor of Science in special education and elementary education from University of Maryland in 1974. So Dr. Wolman has been practicing in Sandy Springs area for almost 30 years. And she previously was with Dekalb County School System for 10 years as a school psychologist, as part of preschool assessment team, and as a Learning Disabilities Resource Room teacher. So she brings a very special perspective from public school and her number of years of expertise in serving as a diagnostician as well as advisor for kids and families in private school. So Judy speaks to many schools and community groups on topics such as behavior management of preschool and elementary age children, living happily with pre-adolescent and building self-esteem, identifying attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and learning disabilities, and all kinds of other topics related to successful parenting. She is an actively involved member of many professional associations, including American Psychological Association, Georgia branch of the International Dyslexia Association, etc. And a personal note, she is married and she has 2 grown-up children. And she says that they have made it through the child and adolescent stages that she addresses in her practice and lectures unscathed, I think. And she's now a proud grandmother as well. I personally have a deep friendship with Judy, and that's one of the reasons that I thought she and I have a deep connection, and going back and forth, me referring to her, she referring to me, and we together helping these kids and adolescents and adults live a better life and with greater insight into self. So that's who we have today, Todd.
Well, goodness, Sucheta, it seems like every guest you have a deep relationship with. I suspect that means that today's conversation is going to be really, really great. So I'm very much looking forward to it. So let's just get right to it then. So here is Sucheta's conversation with Dr. Judy Wolman.
Welcome to the podcast, Judy. I'm so delighted to have you. You are my first educational psychologist, and you and I go long ways. And I'm so honored that you decided to come on board and give us some insights into what you do. So, welcome.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Sucheta.
So, let me start by asking you, what is an educational psychologist, or what does an educational psychologist do? And can you tell our listeners a little bit about your job and your background so we can kind of set up the stage so that they understand how your services can be utilized or why you're an essential part of educational planning?
Absolutely. And there's certainly a lot of terms out there, and I'm always explaining to parents to kind of clarify when they're told that they needed to get testing by a school psychologist, by an educational psychologist, or by a neuropsychologist. What's the difference? And there's a lot of crossover with everyone. Actually, technically, educational psychologists are people who are doing a lot of statistical work regarding testing in Ph.D. programs and in school systems. And really, it's school psychologists that are trained to do assessments and clinical psychologists who focus on testing as one of their areas of expertise. There is also this category of neuropsychologists. And what I explain to parents when they call is that if a child's had some sort of brain injury and there isn't a need to figure out where that injury is and what it's impacting, or a child's got seizures or something that's very brain related that's been an injury, that is usually for a neuropsychologist. Where school psychologists, clinical psychologists sort of shift our focus is it's a little more geared towards what's happening in the classroom in terms of reading and math and spelling and writing. We all look at processing, we all look at intellect, we all look at social emotional functioning, and we're all looking at attention and concentration. But I would say that the slight difference between the neuropsychologists and the school and clinical people is that school clinical psychologists are really looking very intensely at the academic process, a lot more testing in those areas. And the neuropsychologist is really looking more at what's happening in terms of brain functioning to see if there's something that one of those injuries is causing to occur.
So is it fair to say that generally whatever type of psychologist who does assessment is looking at brain behavior relationship? And in educational context, the psychologist is looking at how is the learning or how learning is impacting academic progress. Is that a good way to think about it?
Yes. And so if we're really wondering what the teachers need to be doing and if there's any type of program or special school that a child needs to attend, or even if it's a youngster who we're looking at for some types of accommodations in the schools or even for standardized testing, it's really the clinical and the school people who are doing the kind of assessment that is needed in those settings.
Got it. So why doesn't every child receive a psychoeducational or neuropsychological or clinical psychological evaluation?
I always tell parents that it would be a lovely thing to do for every single learner. The issue is the amount of time that it takes to do one. Each child gets somewhere between 5 to 6 hours of assessment, and so it becomes cost prohibitive. And so I worked in the public schools for 10 years, and I wish we could have done it for every child, but we don't get that opportunity because of the amount of cost that goes into getting it.
So cost sounds like a biggest barrier. So what does a psychologist or educational psychologist finds that a teacher cannot detect?
You know, it's interesting because I was a learning disabilities teacher before I became a school psychologist, and they're both important parts of looking at the way the child learns. It's just that there's a very intensive approach that comes through with the testing. You've got that one child sitting with you for this concentrated period of time, and you're putting them through so many different tasks that you find a huge amount of information in a small amount of time. Whereas I think it takes a teacher a little bit longer in working with that student. And sometimes what in the classroom, you're not sure what you should be expecting from a child. You might have a child who's an average youngster performing on grade level, and that is absolutely perfect performance. But sometimes with the testing, you find out that you've got a very gifted youngster who's managing to scrape by with average reading and math, and that's sometimes an indication that there is an issue, that there may be something like dyslexia going on, but until you do the testing, you don't realize what you should have been expecting from that child.
And also, I think another benefit that you have is you have standardized measures that give you a perspective on what the norms look like, right? Can you tell us a little bit about what that means? What do you compare a child's performance to?
So all of the tests are based on the bell curve. And on that bell curve, a 100 is at the 50th percentile, and that's right on average. And the scores on all of these tests range from very low to very high, so that you're able to compare that child with beautiful norms, that there are people that have spent a great deal of time researching and testing students to get a large normative sample. You're able to test that child to see that, in fact, they are not performing at the potential that we would expect for that particular individual. So if you start with intellectual functioning and you know that they're an average child, you're then able to test them in reading and math and spelling and writing to see if they're performing in those areas consistent with their ability.
So is it possible for a child to have the capacity, because this child is answering questions well, he's at home like talking about dinosaurs or all types of dinosaurs in kindergarten, so we know has got great memory, but then when it comes to learning letters and sounds and composing words, he's not doing that. So is that something that the psychological report will capture all that?
Absolutely. And it's a very common thing that happens, is that parents are thrilled. They know they've got this bright, verbal young child, and then that child suddenly hits school and they start teaching code. And code is just a very different thing. Learning names of letters, learning sounds that go with those letters, learning to blend those sounds. And that sometimes doesn't happen until mid-kindergarten. And then people are sort of blindsided to hear their child's having difficulty when, in fact, my goodness, I've got this really bright child who's well-coordinated, sociable, and it's kind of like, where did this come from? But it's a very different skill and really not one that gets tapped fully until somewhere in the kindergarten range. That said, there are some things that we can look for with younger children to alert us to the fact that maybe there's going to be some difficulty with code. Some of these kids, when they were younger, had a little difficulty remembering names of colors or shapes because those are symbolic things that aren't very meaningful. Or they had difficulty remembering the first letters that started to be introduced. Or they didn't sort of get the rhymes in all the nursery rhymes. They just didn't kind of play with those sounds, a man, can, pan, or enjoy the fact that there are lots of things that start with the same sound, like potato and pancake and popcorn. And those kids that are not playing with some of that symbolic information and that auditory information, sometimes we will start to see that in the kindergarten setting, they're starting to lose some of the advantage that they seem to have before the code started to be introduced.
Got it. So sounds like that there are certain aspects of formal learning which doesn't excuse whether you're interested or not. You have to learn. These children start running into problems, and
Exactly.
Then it becomes a barrier to their success. What are the common reasons that you see children who are in elementary school? And I don't know if I want to break it down like that, but I was hoping maybe you can explain to our listeners that people can reach out to a clinical or educational or neuropsychological expert at different junctures of the child's academic journey. So I was hoping that you can distinguish that in elementary years, what might be the reasons, what might be in the middle school
Sure.
reason, ages, and high school or college. Do you mind sharing that?
Not at all. I think, some of the kids that get picked up earlier, at even age 2 and 3 are kids with some developmental issues with their language. It's not coming along at the expected speed. Certainly kids whose motor coordination is a little bit more obvious as they're not playing on the playground the same way other children are playing. Those things certainly show up. And then I start to hear parents aware that the sensory system isn't working. They've got a child that's annoyed by the feel of the clothing and the feel of the straps in the car seat. And so they're thinking it's behavioral, but sometimes it turns out that it's really sensory. And I always try to get those little people into speech and language or into occupational therapy to begin to address some of those issues. The sooner we get kids in, the better. We know that the brain is very, very responsive to intervention. So we certainly want to jump on that opportunity as quickly as we can. I always say to folks, if your mother gut or your father gut says something's off, don't delay. Even if somebody says, oh, they'll grow out of it. I believe that the worst, so the biggest mistake we might make on one of those kids is that we got them overly stimulated to really strengthen that area of weakness. It's nothing invasive. I just don't like waiting and seeing. I just know that we can make a difference if we get going early. So those are the preschool things that show up. Starting in kindergarten, first grade, we'll start to see things with code. A lot of parents get very anxious when they see their child make reversals of letters like backwards B's and D's, and they think, oh, that's dyslexia. And I have to educate them that, no, that's actually pretty typical and developmental. We don't get very nervous about that. And I explained that dyslexia is actually the cracking of the code of reading and the putting it back into code, both decoding and encoding, so that when the child is looking at the word cat and they're having to remember the sounds of k, at, to blend it for cat, or they want to spell the word cat and they're having to search their memory to remember the formation for those letters to get that word back on paper, that's actually what is dyslexia. And that's going to start to appear somewhere kindergarten first. As the later grades go on, some bright children, by the way, can actually get by for a very long time with no one picking up dyslexia. We've seen it many times where we go to test a youngster where they just don't like to read. They might be in 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grades, and then we do the assessment and we're sort of shocked that, oh my gosh, this child that's gotten by all this time is dyslexic. People will go, well, they weren't a great speller. They didn't like to read. They read slowly. So some bright children, we sometimes even call it stealth dyslexia, can stay under the radar for a long time. I even read an article once about a young student. She was heading off to Harvard, and she just knew something was wrong and ended up getting tested and found out that she was dyslexic, but she covered it all those years with her persistence. And some of these kids can struggle to read the words, and yet somehow they suck the meaning out of the passage because they're so bright. So those things, that dyslexia piece stands out early, but it can also hide for a long time. The comprehension difficulty sometimes is a little later to raise its head. So you've got kids in first and second grade who might be spectacular at cracking the code of reading, but they aren't developing that picture in their mind to match what they're reading. And some of those kids won't show up until second, third, fourth grade. Math reasoning, sometimes kids are very focused on adding, subtracting in the lower grades, and it's the thinking about math and the retrieval of what formula do I need to use. And, once you get to fourth grade, you have to remember, okay, which process do I use? And that renaming and addition and renaming and subtraction is so many steps that those issues can start to appear a little later. And I would say that written language, when kids are young, we expect them to write a sentence. But as they get up into the upper middle grades and middle school, we're going to want them to organize an idea and then try to get that idea onto their paper. And then they have to think about all of the grammatical pieces and the punctuation capitalization and then the spelling. Written language is probably one of the toughest things for kids. So sometimes because they're developing that skill, we may not really see the significance of their difficulty until they get into the late elementary, middle school grades.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you're talking about, as you're talking about these difficulties that the kids are experiencing, a lot of driving force is the academic need and academic relevance. And many times, as you and I have talked about this from our work together for over the last 15 years, that the executive processes are more invisible and intangible compared to the academic, specific reading, specific math, specific writing skills. Can you talk a little bit about just the way you described stealth dyslexia? I feel there's stealth executive dysfunction. When do you see, can you draw a parallel as to what are the reasons when somebody who is academically learning fine in a way, but they're not regulating themselves, that might get referred to you?
Yes. Well, I always say to folks that what I see executive functioning often being is the way that we see the impact of sometimes attention difficulty or learning, how it actually plays out for a child. And it's interesting when I have parents assess their own children with executive functioning at kindergarten, first grade, they often say, well, I can't really tell because I pack their bag and I put all of their, things into their lunchbox and I unpack everything and, clean it out and set it back up. So I don't know if they can or can't. And so I think sometimes it gets hidden for a number of years because people are finding that it's just so easy to sometimes do it themselves for their child that they don't realize, wow, my child is struggling. I do think sometimes parents are aware when their child is good at it because I think those kids take it away from their parents early. I think they go, I've got it, Mom, with taking care of the shower and the process that you have to go through. And, they're running their own homework and they're taking care of keeping their own rooms neat and their bags neat and their desk is neat. And so we don't realize sometimes that those children that aren't fighting to take it over, maybe there is going to be a little issue coming down the pike. As teachers begin to expect more and more independence, I think that's when the executive function piece starts to raise its head a little more. And especially when kids are no longer just with one teacher and one classroom, and they're doing some switching of classes, and they have to coordinate expectations of 2 different rooms or 3 different rooms at school. I really think things can start to fall apart at a rapid speed.
I love your incidental definition of executive function, need to coordinate expectations. I love that.
Yes.
Do you mind taking a minute and telling us a little bit about how you define executive function from the point of view of where the brain-behavior relationship can be deciphered and separated from or integrated with academic demands? How do you define it for parents?
I see the executive function has different pieces, and some of those pieces are a little more with the behavioral regulation. And I think those are the ones that we see earlier. I think, even the preschoolers, we start to see that they're really struggling to self-regulate behaviorally, and they're a little bit impulsive. And of course, it definitely totally overlapped with usually an attention deficit hyperactivity disorder case. Very rare, in my opinion, and maybe you would say something different, but that there isn't usually some attentional component also interacting with executive functioning. And these are kids that are not able to be flexible and to shift. So behaviorally, I think we see it first, along with some of the emotional difficulty with emotional control. Kids are a little rigid and just not as flexible. I think the last piece that comes onto our awareness is the more of the cognitive executive pieces. And part of that is because, again, I don't think our expectations are there when they're little. And then as the expectations begin to increase academically, we want to see a little more of that cognitive regulation starting to come into play. And when they have to organize and when they have to task monitor and when they have to finish things and when they have to organize materials, I think that it starts to appear probably into the elementary grades. And if a child's got a learning disability, it's really exacerbated. The two things really, they dance together.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. In fact, that's how I see it as well, that behavioral dysregulation, then comes that, cognitive dysregulation, and then self-dysregulation, where you're not aware of your own self, you're not aware of your thoughts, you're not aware of your reasons or lack of reasons for not performing well, or those kinds of insight-based deficits.
Right.
Now that, can you explain to us a little bit about measuring? So a typical psychoeducational evaluation includes something like Wechsler Adult Intelligence, or, not adult, but intelligence scale. So
children.
For children, can you talk a little bit about what actually goes into assessing a child's performance when we say a psychoeducational battery?
Sure. So first of all, the initial piece is that a parent is giving us a lot of background history. And whether that is in the form of a written background questionnaire, or some people might do an interview, but we've got to start with that and know what's this child's exposure been, and what have been some of the developmental issues, and are there any medical issues or emotional issues. You've got to put the child in the context of everything that's occurred in their life up to this point. And we also want teacher input. So very critical to have teachers complete forms and rating scales regarding the way they see that child. It's very interesting sometimes when a teacher fills in the rating scales and the background history form, it sort of gets them to stop and think about that student in a different way than when they're filling out a report card. And sometimes I get a lot of information and a very, very honest information that they may not have at that point sort of expressed in their report cards. Report cards tend to be these sort of happy, positive things sometimes, and they aren't giving all of the real data as to what's happening. So I get a lot of background information first. Once I've got the youngster in with me, I always start with the intellectual assessment because that sets the stage for what the child's strengths and weaknesses are, how do they learn. And the intellectual assessment is not just one number because, of course, our thinking is not one number, but we're looking at verbal ability. We're looking at visual spatial ability, being able to put together blocks and puzzles, and looking at their problem-solving ability, things like matrix patterns and other kinds of problem-solving tasks. And then we're looking at an area called working memory, and we're looking both at their auditory working memory and their visual working memory. And that is one of the places that we'll start to see attention difficulty impact a child's performance, and also being able to organize and be executively together to be able to do those kinds of tasks.
Give us an example of what how to measure working memory, whether it's auditory or visual working memory.
So the Wechsler scale, for example, asks children to repeat digits forwards, and then to repeat digits backwards, and then to repeat digits in ascending order. And that is a task that is not intellectual, but it does require being present. And if a child slips in and out of focus, they're going to lose some of those digits. I always say to parents, when they see a low score and they go, well, where would I see this at home? And it would be the child that you say, okay, I want you to please go upstairs, put these shoes in your closet, get your belt for Boy Scouts, and I want you to be in the car. And then parent goes upstairs, the child's sitting on the stairs picking lint because they just lost the whole thing that they were sent to do. Sometimes parents will say, oh, no, if I give an example like go upstairs, brush your teeth, put on pajamas, get in bed, they'll go, oh, they're great at it. And I go, but wait a minute. Sometimes all we have to say on that direction is wah, 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 wah. And the kids know it's getting dark. They've had dinner. They've had their bath. They know that there's the process. And they aren't really using working memory. They're just using the fact
Context.
that it's predictable. Yeah. So in the WISC, the digit repetition, that's the auditory working memory test they use. And then they have actually brought in a new visual working memory where the child looks at a group of pictures, turns the page, and then has to find those pictures in the right sequence from a larger group of pictures. So if you stay focused, turn the page, you'll be able to do it. But if you lost focus for a bit of, a couple seconds, you turn the page and go, oh my gosh, I don't remember what I just saw. Or if you were thinking about something else, you've lost the focus for it. So, those are two ways that they use it on the Wechsler test. Different tests probably have different ways. When kids are younger, before they're old enough, before age 6, and it's a preschool version of the test, they actually don't do the auditory visual working. They do visual memory, but they do not do an auditory memory. And the visual memory that they do doesn't require the pictures to be retained in sequence because that's just too tough for a little 5-year-old. But they just require you to remember what in any order, what you saw. And then the processing speed is the fourth section on a WISC test. And that looks at paper pencil speed with the idea that either following a code or finding things that match on a line quickly does also require staying focused, staying persistent on the task, kind of keeping your head on that job instead of being distracted. With little kids, by the way, they don't expect pencil tasks. They use an ink dauber with the same concept of trying to stay focused to get a job done.
So when you say these 4 components and collectively they give you information about the child's intellectual ability, so that includes reasoning skills and higher order thinking skills too, right?
Yes.
Or not yet?
Yes, no, it does. Absolutely. That's, all the verbal things. The verbal tasks go into abstract concepts. They start concrete. The visual spatial tasks also start with concrete things with blocks and puzzles, but then require much more abstract mental manipulation.
Is it possible for a child to have a profile where there is a gap between these skills. So can you explain to us that if these two scores, which is verbal and performance scores, if they are matching or at that same level, that's showing a wholesome brain development, which are both skills that are kind of in coordination with each other. Is that a good way to think about it?
So it's interesting because when I've been in this field for a very long time, and when I first started, they thought a learning disability was if there was a 15-point difference between your verbal ability and your nonverbal ability. And then we realized, wait a minute, that's way too simplistic because we're just all such a combination of strengths and weaknesses, and that's what makes us unique. So there are some very brilliant future engineers who might be a little bit above average in their verbal ability, but not at the level of their exceptional visual spatial ability. It's not a learning disability. It's just a difference in the way that unique person learns and functions, and it kind of predicts what we're going to see from that person down the road. So I would say most of our most talented architects, engineers, probably aren't always as strong in vocabulary, but they're not learning disabled. And the same is true the opposite, that some of our future attorneys and future professors might be okay with blocks and puzzles, but they aren't necessarily going to pick that as their summer vacation job, activity. They're not going to want that big puzzle that's set up on the dining room table at the condo. They're going to read a book. And that doesn't mean they're learning disabled either. So it's not the differences in our intellectual ability that necessarily mean learning disability. Those differences in our intellectual ability kind of give a sense of where our strengths and weaknesses are. We then look to see, is it causing learning difficulty when we get to the point of reading and math and spelling and writing? If it's not, it's a non-issue. I remember actually when I was learning how to give the test, and I was on a preschool assessment team with a very bright speech-language pathologist. And when I was practicing the test with her, her verbal ability was literally off the chart, but her blocks and puzzles were just sort of okay. She wasn't learning disabled, but she sure wasn't going to change the oil in her car. She was going to pay somebody else to do that. So we all have these patterns of strengths and weaknesses. It's an issue if it causes a learning difficulty, if it causes us not to be doing our reading, our math, our spelling, our writing at the level that you would expect.
So in conclusion, when you see a report and when you're getting ready to discuss with the parents, what concerns you the most, or what is it that you want the parents or educators get out of this report that is going to inform them about this child's potential, child's current state of affairs, child's, as you mentioned, the learning difficulty he's enduring? What are a few points you want them to really, really not forget or not lose sight of?
First of all, important to realize that it's focus on your whole child, so even if we come up with some things that we need to work on, let's not forget that we're supposed to do all the fun things as a family and not get totally focused on what we're trying to strengthen. So we want to make sure we're focusing on the child's strengths, fun things that they do well, great things as a family. In that context, we then want to make sure that if a particular child needs some strengthening in a certain area, we need to talk with the teachers and get them attending to that. We may want to supplement what we're getting at school with private tutoring using the right method. The testing will kind of direct what seems to be the right method for that particular child. So we want to use the opportunity when kids are young and their brains are able to grow so well to give them the right interventions to make those changes. But we also want to make sure we keep an eye on focusing on the strengths too.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing you say that don't consider this report to be final. It's not a verdict. It's a kind of reference point.
Absolutely not. It's to direct some intervention, and it's static. It's going to move. And that's why usually somewhere within a 3 to 5 year period, we really do redo it because kids can change so much, especially when some of the things that are recommended are implemented. You can end up seeing a very different profile for a child 3 to 5 years down the road.
Well, Judy, this was so enlightening, and thank you for taking the time to walk us through this. And I can't wait to have our next conversation about how to kind of incorporate this information and how do you communicate that with the parents. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast and giving us your insights and wisdom. And again, as I said, let's talk more.
My pleasure. Thanks, Sucheta.
Well, yep, as I suspected, a great conversation with Dr. Judy Wolman. Goodness, Sucheta. I don't know where to begin. Why don't you lead us off with some initial thoughts?
Yes, so true, Todd. I'm glad that Judy took the time to explain the professional jargon because it can always create barriers for people when seeking help or guidance. There are a few fundamental approaches to evaluating brain behavior relationship. There's something called psychoeducational testing, and then there's a neuropsychological testing. And also, of course, psychologists do other types of testing, but we are going to limit, or we have been focused on the educational arena and child's ability to succeed in spite of the challenges he's facing. So most professionals have their personal websites that tell parents and educators the services they provide. I personally always recommend parents to interview their educational or psychologist or the neuropsychologist. What I mean by that is all these services or these process-centric options in life are relationship based, and you are going to work with this psychologist for a while, and he or she is going to help you walk on this bridge that takes you across and prepare you for advocacy. And you need to have a sense of comfort and confidence that you and that the psychologist understands where you're coming from, and you completely understand what the psychologist is going to recommend. So this interview process isn't getting on the phone in the beginning and just saying, can you please tell me what you do and how does this help you know more about my child? Kind of getting those questions out of the way. And other thought that comes to mind is very important, is that these assessments are neither cheap nor quick. So it truly is an investment. And I hope people got this from our discussion, that it is our kind of consumer obligation to become informed person to understand what we are going to get from this kind of assessment. So I'm glad that she started us off with that.
Well, clarify something for me. I mean, why would we even want to test a child?
Yeah, so I think there's teachers who, after the child goes to school, for example, the most time the child spends is with their teachers, or in the classroom with the peers and the teachers. So the parents are even spending less time during the weekday with the child. And so the teachers, in a way, are experts, and they begin to notice a lot of things that are demonstrated through behaviors, but not everything that you see is a problem. It could be a normal variation of what we call a range of being normal, so to speak. And that's why we need some expert opinion to see, how does this compare with the national standard? How does this compare with group of peers, and not just one or two, but thousands of them? And that's what a psychologist can really do. So when a student falls short in managing the class expectations or doesn't know how to deal with demands of his learning environment, that's when the struggles begin, right? And the learning difficulties of a student can be stressful, and they can impact everyone, including the members of the classroom, the teacher or the support teacher, the principal, and also the entire family. Some struggles are veiled, but mostly they are self-evident. But whatever the case may be, it is undoubtedly impacts the student's sense of self-efficacy and self-confidence. If left unaddressed, it can take a toll on the student's mood, affect, social interpersonal relationships, and eventually self-esteem. So the psychoeducational testing focuses on identifying learning processes and even issues such as attention that may be impacting the child's or adolescent's capacity to live an enriched academic life. As part of this process, a social emotional evaluation is also often offered. This can address how these social emotional adjustment issues are impacting learning or processing of information, or even attention or concentration skills. Eventually, all these abilities collectively impact relationships, classroom relationships, and relationship to learning. So that's why we must assess. And final thought is that an educational psychologist who performs a thorough and comprehensive evaluation has tremendous training and understanding, and has a deep knowledge of how to interpret the test results and form meaning and contextualize to the child's presentations, the report that the teachers and parents provide, as well as a longstanding history from birth. And so that's when a full picture begins to emerge. So a comprehensive evaluation allows the clinician to rule out other diagnoses and provide a right kind of recommendation plan that actually addresses the child. That's why the testing is essential.
Yeah, but wow, this testing process seems quite complicated and quite involved, yeah?
Yes, absolutely. A starting point of it all is a child who is experiencing issues, and that's negatively impacting the child's ability. So that's the starting point. An educational psychologist, through testing, figures out where the issues are, and that's what allows the clinician distinguish whether it's a true learning disability, is it an adjustment challenge, is it a mini crisis that child is experiencing, and if the child is removed from that challenging environment, he may be able to perform at the expected level, so it's not a disability. This type of evaluation takes several hours to complete, and it's usually conducted over several days. It involves around 5 to 6 hours of testing at a time. And as I said, it may be broken down over 2 days. It's either followed or precedes with an in-depth parent interview and lots of forms, case history form, observational form that are given to the parents, as well as checklists given to teachers. So this in-depth evaluation leads to an in-depth remediation plan that is designed to address all the concerns or red flags. Finally, the psychologist produces a detailed written report, and this particularly acts as a guiding post that the parents can use as they seek services, or the teachers can use to build academic support in the classroom. So, the psychologists deploy many evaluation methods. They use something called WISC, which is Wechsler Intelligence Scale. For children, they use something called a Woodcock-Johnson test of achievement that's used to figure out the level of academic achievement. There may be other tests or components that evaluate or discern information processing abilities or personality and emotional functioning as well. There are parts of the test that address perceptual reasoning and nonverbal reasoning abilities, and eventually the past records, the visits to the psychologist, psychiatrist, ER. So those kinds of pieces of information together help the educational psychologist formulate a composite picture. A neuropsychological evaluation, on the other hand, is requested typically when there are concerns about something more complicated than just learning disability that's impacting the child's overall functioning in the classroom. So maybe there's a possibility of brain injury. There may be seizure disorder. There may be some inherent brain dysfunction. Child has experienced something called anoxic injury at birth. So those are the kinds of added components make the psychologist use different set of or additional set of test material that can address some detailed aspects of cognitive functioning or even executive function aspects. So, for example, the psychologist may use that in addition to the WISC, which is the Wechsler Intelligence Scale that I was talking about. They may use some test battery to assess memory functions. They may use something called NEPSI, Developmental Neuropsychological Assessment Battery, for evaluating functions such as attention, language, sensory motor, and visual spatial functioning. So there are tests like Wisconsin card sorting, or Ray Osterreich complex figure drawing, or Tower of Hanoi. These kinds of tests give additional information of executive function. So what we are looking at is the evaluation process is complex, and it takes an expert mind to discern the various forms to identify and hone into the specifics of the child's abilities and inabilities so that a good plan can be formulated.
Well, goodness, Sucheta, I was going to ask you, are there different types of tests that psychologists can perform? And certainly there are, and I understand why there are different types and why you would do that. So, all right, well, move us into final thoughts before we wrap up this conversation.
Yes, so the most important message I have for parents out there and teachers out there, that if there are some signs, there are red flags, don't ignore them. The red flags, all it means that the child's way of approaching learning is not yielding the best outcome for the child. And that means the child has some specific challenge that he needs to understand for himself, and others need to explain to the child. going to get the child tested is incredibly important because that will inform everyone involved what to do and how to deliver what will be most effective. And education, just like everything else, one size fits all doesn't work. And how to tailor the educational aspects only can become more evident after these kinds of test measures are used. The next thing is find an expert that knows and fits your own expectations. I think going into testing, many things are available on the website. So everybody needs to take the time to really read and inform themselves. There's a website like understood.com that explains things about how to understand learning disabilities. There is something like International Dyslexia Association website that describes what dyslexia is all about. There's a CHAD, and I will link all this in on our website. But all those websites describe the symptoms, describe how the child presents with problems. And I'm not limiting this to children. There are so many adults that as the parents experience these challenges with their children, that may be their first time to discover that, oh my God, I myself am suffering from this. I always thought that was something wrong with me, or something that has an idiosyncrasy in me that there's no hope for me to change it. But a lot of times that parents have gone through these evaluations themselves. So everybody needs to take a moment to reflect and pause and not get so scared about challenges and weaknesses, but embrace them, welcome them. Finally, what I feel is information is power. Information is the guiding light that allows us to take good decisions. And include your child in these conversations. Don't leave the child alone. Don't get these complex and comprehensive evaluations done and never share that information with the child. There are lots of psychologists, as I will share with you in future interviews, that recommend that prepare a separate summary report. And many do, and discuss those report findings with the child so that he or she can be an empowered student and a learner who has great optimism from their learning experience.
Well, Sucheta, as you said at the very top of the show, a poor educational experience can have a lifelong impact as adults. So important. All right, it's all the time we have for today. On behalf of our host, Sucheta Kamath, and all of us at Cerebral Matters, thank you for tuning in and listening today, and we look forward to seeing you next week with our second conversation with Dr. Judy Wolman.
Thank you for listening to Full Prefrontal, Exposing the Mysteries of Executive Functions. To contact our host, Sucheta Kamath, and learn more about her work on improving executive functions, visit her website at cerebralmatters.com. That's cerebralmatters.com. Tune in next week for the next informative episode of Full Prefrontal.